I'm Richard Harris, and welcome to Real Risk, the podcast that talks to people who put themselves in harm's way. You know the type. Big wave surfers, professional soldiers, base jumpers. I'll get inside the heads of men and women who seem fearless or even reckless. They might seem crazy to us, but most are far from it. We'll be talking about putting your life on the line for something important. We're talking about real risk. G'day, Richard Harris here with another episode of Real Risk, the Adventure Podcast. How good was Tim Jarvis, and what an inspiring conversation, which has actually generated a lot of feedback, so thank you all very much for the constructive criticism and some quite touching messages of how you enjoyed the podcast. Keep them coming, and as I said, I'll send out a signed copy of the book Against All Odds every month to a random correspondent. For the month of June, the book will be going out to Daniel Fletcher. Thanks, Daniel, and thanks everyone else for their feedback. To today's guest, imagine being the most isolated person on the earth, more than 1,000 miles from another human being, days away from help and in a constantly changing and highly unpredictable environment. Between you and kilometres of deep ocean, the thin fiberglass skin of a 50-foot sailing boat, a mere speck in the vast southern ocean. This is the story of Lisa Blair, an Australian woman who discovered in herself a burning desire to do something that would test her mental and physical abilities on the near-freezing gladiator's ring that is the sub-Antarctic seas. After learning to sail at the relatively late age of 22, she set her mind to building the experience and skills which would make an attempt on the solo circumnavigation of Antarctica acceptably safe. Despite her mother's initial request not to try such a dangerous voyage, she set out for an adventure which would prove more challenging and perilous than she could have imagined. And in the process, Lisa learnt a great deal about herself. G'day, Lisa. Thank you very much for joining me.
Thanks for having me on the show today.
Now, your accomplishments as a solo ocean sailor are simply extraordinary, I have to say. But I imagine the ocean can be a truly terrifying place, and even more so when you're by yourself. Where did the idea, or when did the idea first gel in your mind that this is something I want to do?
Yeah, it's an interesting one because I think an idea of such a scale, like sailing solo around Antarctica, it's not something that happens overnight. It's sort of an accumulation of smaller achievements, giving you the confidence to then look at potentially one day achieving something that's like monumental that a lot of people considered was impossible at the time. And so for me, it sort of all, I guess, started when I started sailing. I was 22, got a job in the Whitsundays on a charter yacht as the cook and the cleaner. Just immediately found this passion on the water with boats. And for me, it was all about the mental factor that goes along with sailing, where you have to puzzle out problems and find solutions. And when you're in the middle of the ocean or you're sailing, or whether it's day sailing or yacht racing, you're still trying to use all the tools in your toolbox, so to speak, to create an answer to a problem. And that problem might be, how do I get a boat from A to B just harnessing the wind? Or how do I adapt with the tide and the current to the navigation? Or, hey, my engine's broken, how do I fix it? So all these kind of problems and challenges we face on the water, it really attracted me to sailing because it allowed me to really push myself and learn. And it was an environment that was constantly changing. So I sort of started just developing more skills in sailing and starting to sail further afield. And I think I was around 25, 26 when I had the chance to sail across an ocean for the first time. And I'd sailed with some friends from Samoa to Hawaii over 3 months. And it was cruising, so there was no stress, there was no time limit. We were just taking our time and exploring the islands that we sailed past and everything as well. But for me, it was kind of a pivotal part in my world because I saw that there's this unique kind of sense of adventure that you could get from traveling from A to B across an ocean on a boat. And the lifestyle that you have at sea is so stripped back to basics. It's the basics and necessities of eat, sleep, sail, and your entire focus is either about what the weather's doing or what your next meal is going to be or how many hours sleep did you manage to get that day. And it sort of really simplifies the noise that we get in sort of our modern society with all these phones and Twitter and social media and everything. So for me, it sort of all started there, and then the goals just kept getting bigger.
Some people go to Bali to eat, pray, love. You go to on the ocean to what? Eat, sleep, sail. So that sounds good to me.
Exactly.
So you've actually been sailing for a relatively short period of time compared to, people who start in dinghies as kids and things. But I gather you've amassed over 80,000 nautical miles on the ocean now. Is that true?
Yes, I have. I basically came back from that sailing trip across to Hawaii and I got a crap job. I was flat broke. I had finished my degree at university, which was visual arts and education. And I was just sort of had this sense of longing for further adventures, but I didn't really know what kind of shape or form they were going to take. And I knew I wasn't ready to go into a formal work structure of 9 to 5 teaching and sort of entering what I like to term the daily grind. And I was still sort of thirsty for that adventure. So I started looking at other ways to get out amongst it. And at the same time, I started reading a lot of books on solo sailors. So it was all like Jesse Martin, Kay Coddy, Robin Knox Johnson, and to sailors, they're legends in the field, and they're the first people to sail around the world solo, or the first woman to do it solo, or the youngest. And there were all these incredible stories of these people that had gone through this journey where they didn't really have any skills. They'd worked it out, they found the money, got a boat, and then just off they went, and they kind of winged it and set an amazing record. So I started sort of dreaming about maybe one day that might be something I'd like to try. And my one day, I was thinking, maybe when I'm 40 or 50, I might have enough experience to do something like that. But at the same time, I found out about a yacht race called the Clipper Round the World Yacht Race. You sign up, pay a berth fee, and then you race each other around the world. And there's 10 identical boats with 16 to 18 crew on each boat, and you sail 40,000 nautical miles around the world. And so for me, at that point in life, I was like looking for this next adventure, found this race, and I didn't have any real experience apart from crewing at a very entry-level crew level. And I was like, this would be an amazing platform to actually just get a lifetime's worth of experience in a year or 2 years window of opportunity. And then I could maybe go and look at those other adventures that I wanted to do.
A visual arts degree doesn't really make me picture someone who has to be a pretty roughy, tufty, ocean-going gal, if you don't mind me saying, because you've got to be a diesel mechanic, you've got to be chief navigator, cook, bottle washer, and pull on ropes, and endure a bit of hardship out there. So, what were you thinking with the visual arts? Was that not really you in retrospect, or is that still something that's important to you?
It's still something that's definitely important to me, but I kind of, once I discovered sailing was a real passion of mine, I put it on the back burner because I feel like it's something that I can focus on or do at any point in my life, whereas sailing is something that I really wanted to focus on while I was young and fit and healthy and had the freedom of being able to do it without having, a husband and kids or other kind of responsibilities in life. So it was something that I felt that I could go and spend the next 5 years exploring and adventuring with, and then one day I'll come back and I'll do the visual arts.
Because you amassed a lot of qualifications in that 10-year period where you were building up to do these major expeditions. You're a master offshore yachtsman, master class 5 skipper ticket, marine engineer, and did you enjoy all that study and learning all those skills?
Yeah, I love it actually, because I think that's one of the things I love with sailing so much is it challenges me. I don't think you could ever call yourself an expert of sailing. I don't think anyone can call themselves an expert of sailing. You can have very experienced sailors, but nobody's an expert because there's just so much diversity in the fields of sailing, between being a boat builder, a shipwright, to an marine electronics engineer, to a mechanical engineer, to the rigger, to the sailmaker, to the meteorologist. Like, there's just so many kind of things in play that, I think I tried. I always kind of knew that I wanted to go and do some form of extreme adventure. I was planning on sailing around the world on my own at some point in my life. So I sort of threw myself into just trying to amass as many skills and knowledge as I could. And I also found it quite difficult to learn a lot of those skills on the water because they would always put the most experienced person to make that repair in a teamed boat. And so for me, it wasn't until I started really solo sailing that I was able to really learn about engines and 12-volt systems and marine electronics and hand stitching sails back together and tuning my own rigging and splicing ropes. And it was all this stuff that I had to figure out because I was stuck on a boat on my own and there was no one else there to help me.
And certainly plenty of motivation to have those potentially life-saving skills if you're out there by yourself and things aren't going well. I mean, I share your passion for learning. I'm a bit of a badge collector myself, and when something really takes my fancy, like diving has in my case, I just want to learn everything about it, do every course, get trained in every aspect of it, whether it's the equipment repair or compressors or, the gases and all the rest of it. So I think it's wonderful, especially, later in life when you start to really be clear in your mind what you want to do. And once you find something that you're passionate about, educating yourself is a huge pleasure and great part of the adventure.
Sailing was never on my radar, at all, until I got that job in the Whitsundays. And so it's sort of like a 180 in my career path from slow and steady and safe in this, 9-to-5 work environment to running sponsorship campaigns and trying to work out a way to fund my sailing to go and do these extreme events. So, yeah, you've got to have kind of, I guess, the determination, the focus and the desire to want to do it, to get it to that level.
Yeah, well, that's a good point because for many, maybe all adventurers, fundraising and preparation are almost as daunting as the voyage itself, I think. And it always seems to come right down to the wire for the departure date. I remember reading Jessica Watson's book and Jesse Martin's book, and the guys who row, rowing boats across the Atlantic or across the Tasman. All these guys seem to have a list of jobs that look like 12 months' work, and they've got 6 days to do it. Was that the same for you?
Exactly the same. I had a 6-month refit that I had to complete in 6 weeks. I was completely underfunded, but the funding I got was just enough to get through, and then I was able to get more bank loans, credit cards, anything I could to just kind of get to the start line. I came back with like $40,000 in bills from satellite phones and the likes. And then it was just this insane jobs list. And every time you think you're kind of getting close to being ready, you then look at the jobs list and you go, oh, wait, I've still got all of these. And that's going to take me a week. And that's going to take me 3 days. And that's going to, wait, I'm leaving in 2 days. How am I going to do this? And you've just got to do it because you have no choice by that point. Like, you could pull out, but your whole focus is going. And for me, it took me 3.5 years to get the boat, to figure out a way to buy the boat, to get the funding and get the campaign developed enough and enough kind of, I guess, credibility in the industry to actually go out and leave for this trip. And I remember thinking in the first 2 weeks of my departure that I was getting more sleep at sea in 20-minute intervals than I was in the couple of months leading up to my departure.
Yeah, this is a very familiar story I'm hearing for all sorts of expeditioners. And I think it was the same back in Mawson and Shackleton's day. My last episode was with the amazing Tim Jarvis. And he describes all the same things. And we did talk about whether it would have been different in the early 1900s compared to the modern day, but just different problems and different types of issues, I guess. But you're still trying to satisfy the sponsors and meet deadlines and pay enormous bills out of your own account.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm a one-man band. It was me doing everything with volunteers that would come and help. And I had another really good friend of mine who was a shipwright who came and donated heaps of time. But I wasn't just trying to refit the boat. I was also, trying to raise the rest of the sponsorship, trying to do media interviews, trying to do social media, and trying to manage all of that was just, a huge amount of work. I think I spent more time on my phone than actually working on the boat. And I had completely random strangers offer to donate time from here and there, and I would set them up on the boat with a job, and then I would be on my phone chasing down another lead somewhere and just trying to figure out a way to make it work.
I guess the trip we're talking about that you're preparing for is your solo circumnavigation of Antarctica. And how on earth do you choose Antarctica as a place to sail around? Why not just go around the world like everyone else?
Well, because everyone else has done it. When I finished the Clipper race, I remember there was this pivotal kind of moment in my life where my mindset sort of changed. And I had spent 12 months trying to fundraise $80,000 for the berth fee for the Clipper race. And then I spent 12 months racing this yacht around the world. And I remember kind of getting to the finish line and we're packing up the boat at the end of the project. And I remember just sort of taking a minute and going, holy cow, I've just literally circumnavigated the planet. Like, this was something that I'd never even considered was possible 2 years ago. And here I am, a circumnavigator. And I started asking the question of myself, well, what else am I capable of? And so I knew I really wanted to do solo sailing. And I knew that that was a pathway that I was really interested in. And I used the platform with the Clipper race to, I guess, analyze all the situations we found ourselves in as crew and visualize how I would have reacted or managed the same situation if I was on my own. So if we're in the middle of a storm, if we had gear failure, man overboards, like the whole lot, and I would go, well, okay, so if I'm on my own, I could do it this way or that way. And so that helped me know that in theory, on paper, I could sail solo. I'd never done it, but I knew in theory I could. And so I signed up for a yacht race called the Solo Trans-Tasman Yacht Race, which is where you race from New Zealand to Australia, and it runs once every 4 years. And I remember at the time I called up to sign up, I called the race committee and I said, hey, I've just entered your race. What's the latest date that I could tell you that I have a boat? Because at that time I had $0, zero savings, 12 months to the race start. And I ended up being the only female entry and the only person that didn't actually own a boat trying to sign up for a yacht race. So I remember the guy just laughing at me, thinking I was crazy and that they would take my $1,000 deposit and move on and that I probably would never get there. So that sort of sparked another 12-month journey of growth where I had this new plan. I was going to do this next race, but I needed to find a boat. And through that journey of boat finding, I came across a guy who was trying to sell a 40-foot open racing boat called Arnsey Girl, and his name's James. And I was trying my hardest to convince him to license the boat to me to be able to do that race with. And through my conversations with him over a couple of weeks, he finally turned around and said, look, I'm really sorry, I can't license you the boat. I've got it up for sale. I need to sell the boat. But have you considered combining your trip or this yacht race with something bigger and then packaging them together so it's more attractive for sponsors? And he said, have you thought of this Antarctica record? And I was like, what? No, Antarctica, it's not going to happen. It's too dangerous. I've sailed in the Southern Ocean on an 80-foot boat and that was scary. I don't want to go back down there on a 40-foot boat on my own as my first big trip. And so we kind of ended our conversations, but he had planted the seed, so to speak. And I went back to work and I buried the goal of getting his boat and I buried the goal of doing Antarctica, and I kept trying to find another boat somewhere else. I started kind of finding myself constantly thinking about the possibility of, is it possible to do something like Antarctica? And I started going through the motions of asking myself, well, how cold is it really going to get down there? What's the margins that I have to sail in? And how fast is it going to be? What's the strongest winds I'm likely to experience? How big are the waves going to get? How many storms should I expect? And I sort of started researching a lot of the historical weather data on that trip and in the Southern Ocean. And I spent about 3 months researching it and not really making a commitment, but I was slowly going, well, hang on, the information's showing me on paper that this is actually possible. It's just like going to be really uncomfortable and really difficult, but that doesn't mean it's not possible. So I sort of broached the conversation with my mum and she said, absolutely no way, not going to happen. She was nervous about me sailing across to New Zealand, let alone around Antarctica. And I was like, okay, all right, well, if I just tell sponsors that that's what I'm going to do, and I have a couple of years then to build the experience up, and I think by the time I do all of those things, I potentially might be ready to go and sail around Antarctica solo. And she wasn't keen, but she agreed. And so I committed to the goal of trying to find sponsorship for Antarctica and this Trans-Tasman yacht race. Never happened. I didn't get the sponsors. So I ended up saving all my money over that year and being able to borrow a boat off a friend, refitted it just before I left, and then without ever sailing it before, my first solo passage was sailing from Sydney over to New Zealand to deliver the boat to the start line.
So were those days in the Tasman Sea sufficient for you to clarify in your own mind that solo sailing was something that you could do?
I'm a big believer with sailing, with adventure in general. If you can do it for a day, you can do it for 24 hours. And if you can do it for 24 hours, you can do it for 2 days. If you can do it for 2 days, you can do it for a week. If you can do it for a week, you might as well do it for a month. You've just got to plan for it and make sure that you've got the right kind of control measures or risk assessment in place. And so for me, sailing across to New Zealand, whilst to most people would seem like a really extreme way to entry level into solo sailing, was a good sort of test run for me, because it allowed me to have moderate weather for around 8 days, one big storm, land wasn't too far away, it's fairly open ocean, so I've got plenty of room to run, and it allowed me to sort of figure out how to make it work. When you're solo sailing, there's just you on the boat, so you use an autopilot to drive the boat while you're managing the ropes and the winches and running around the deck, figuring out what works and what doesn't, and what's the best way to sort of manage a system like that. So it was a really good journey for me, and I felt like, it was 3,000 miles for the return voyage, which is a fairly decent amount of time at sea, and it allowed me to have a lot of confidence that moving forward, I would be capable of doing something like sailing solo around Antarctica.
That first night when you go down into the cabin and put your head down for a sleep, is that terrifying to leave the boat unattended the first time you do that?
Yeah, I didn't do that for about 3 days. I slept in the cockpit on the floor, and I have a little oven timer, a little mechanical oven timer, and I'd set it to 20 minutes, and then I'd put it near my ear, and I would sleep to a tick, 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 and eventually it would go off and wake me up. But, in 20-minute intervals, you don't actually get sleep. You get cat naps, and by the third or fourth time, you're generally kind of lulled enough between checks on deck that you can actually get a little bit of sleep, 10, 15 minutes sleep in that little 20-minute gap. But it's not an exact science. It's not a great way to live long term. It's very exhausting.
And I guess the closer to shore you are, or the more in the shipping lanes you are, the shorter your sleeps have to be.
The higher the risk. Yeah, so to compare them, so with the New Zealand trip, I was on a new boat with an AIS system that had a loose connection somewhere. Now, AIS is a automatic identification system, and it's a way that we can see container ships and that they can see us and that they can see each other. But it only works if the boat has the system on board, and it's not mandatory for yacht to carry them. It's only mandatory for commercial vessels. So I have them on my boats, but not everybody will. So you can't guarantee that it's the only thing that's going to spot people. But for me, it was unreliable as well on top of that. And there's quite a lot of shipping lanes between Australia and New Zealand. So I wasn't comfortable for the whole trip to New Zealand to sleep for more than 20 minutes at a time. But in saying that, I would sleep, 8 to 10 hour blocks of 20-minute naps. And I might get an hour and a half, 2 hours in, and then have to get up on deck and change the sails a little bit or do something. And then I'd go straight back to sleep. So you tend to find that you're sleeping day and night rather than having a period of sleep and then a period of time where you're awake. When I did Antarctica, however, once I got down below the 45 degrees south line, there was almost no one in those waters apart from the occasional long-line fishing boat, the odd Japanese whaling ship, Sea Shepherd, and a couple of cruise ships that were heading to some of the more remote islands. And so we were monitoring the AIS from land. So my shore team was monitoring that, and they would send me updates. So we could see when I was coming into an area that was known for fishing or a traffic zone, so to speak, around an island or something. And so I would regress back to my 20-minute sleeps when I was approaching those areas. And then when I got back into more open water, then I would sleep. Mostly I'd get 40 minutes.
So you're well supported by the shore team, obviously, and I guess they're giving you meteorological information and so forth. But do you still feel very alone out there, even though you've got that communication?
There's a system called Iridium Go, which it basically turns your mobile phone into a satellite phone. And it's only really good for text messaging and very low data downloads for like the odd grid file for weather or short phone calls. And so because I had that, I would update my shore team every morning via text message, and I'd get a couple of replies. And having the ability to text at sea was a game changer because it meant you could get an almost instant response. And at one point in the voyage, that system broke for like 2 weeks. I couldn't get it working. And I found that my whole experience with isolation changed when that system went down, because I couldn't get that instant connection with someone. When I would send a message to a friend and get a message back, I would have to go into the nav station, boot up the computer, boot up the satellite system for the computer, type an email, send the email, and then wait a couple of hours for someone to log into their own emails, spot my email, respond, download it, and then like I would have to find it again on my computer a couple of hours later. So took away any of that instantaneous kind of connection. And in that couple of weeks, I definitely noticed myself feeling a lot more lonely than I did previously.
Yeah, I've got the same system actually, the Iridium Go, and I use it when I'm in remote places, exploring caves, and you're in the mountains, and there's no other way to communicate with anyone. And I do find after 4 or 5 days out there, you send a text to my wife and get a reply, and it just really does make you feel connected and buoys your spirits up a bit.
And I was only talking to my family once a week. So apart from the odd media interview, I would talk to my mum, my dad, and my sister once a week, and then my shore team and my PR person, who was a volunteer lady called Tracy. And that was it. So that was my only human connection, was an email a day from my meteorologist, occasionally an email from mum, and then this one phone call once a week, or the text messages. So you are so much more further removed from day-to-day life. And I mean, I was down there for months. So, it's a long time to be on your own.
Is there a danger of going a bit bonkers? Can you go a bit crazy?
Is something that I think is really hard to prepare for, because you don't know how you're going to react until you're in that situation, until you've been down there in isolation for a long period of time. I think you can plan for different reactions, where you might get some despondency, or you might be quite happy and quite okay with your own, self-imposed isolation, or you might need that company, so you increase your phone calls and stuff. But I didn't notice a direct negative effect out of it. I did notice that every time I had a media interview, especially if it was a panel of people for a TV show or something, and they would all interview you at the same time, it was so exciting, because I had this whole group of people that I'd never spoken to before that I was talking to, and it was like a real conversation, and it might only last for like 5 minutes, but I would be so energized for the rest of that day from that one media interview. So I think when I'm on my own, I tried to just make sure I stayed really distracted, read a lot of books when I wasn't needing to sail the boat. There's lots of maintenance that needs to happen, and you're sleeping for half the time, trying to do these little micro sleeps.
When you seem like quite a gregarious and outgoing person, and I think the definition of an extrovert is someone who actually refuels or re-energizes by surrounding themselves with other people. So you don't seem like the sort of person who would want to wander off for 4 or 5 or 6 months and enjoy your own company. But obviously it sat really well with you.
Yeah, I think I'm one of those people that's 50-50. I really like my own company for a lot of the time, but then I also love being around people, but not doing both consistently, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So like I like to be able to do my projects because I love planning them, developing them, and succeeding in them. And then I come back from the projects and it's chaos on land and you're surrounded by people 24/7. I was a little worried about my mental state with it all. So when I moved back to Australia after the record, I actually went house hunting to rent somewhere, and I made sure that I found a share house with 4 other people in it, because I knew I didn't want to live on my own and I didn't want to live with just one other person who I might never see. So I made sure that I actually moved into a big share house to have some human interaction around me after the project.
When you're out there by yourself, do you find yourself talking to the dolphins and talking to the birds, or do you sing at the top of your voice? What do you do? Tell me something crazy that you do out there.
I think I would jump overboard if I sang at the top of the voice. So I find that your boat has a personality, and so I wouldn't necessarily talk to the boat, but I would say my thoughts out loud. And so I'd be like, I'm going to make porridge for lunch. What do I need to get for porridge? And I'd like rustle around in the lockers, and I'd just be saying all my internal thoughts or my internal monologue verbalized. And then quite a few times I directly link this to sleep deprivation, when I was completely empty, running on the bottom of my tank. And I'd be still battling in the middle of a storm or something and, just getting my ass kicked and getting shoved around the boat, thrown from side to side in the cabin, or having to be on deck in icy cold winds. And I'd be putting a reef in the sail or like changing the sails or doing something on the deck, and like the rope would get caught or something would happen that would stop me from being able to do it. And it'd be the smallest thing that wasn't even slightly a problem. And I would just lose it completely. And I would shout and scream and I would call the boat names. And I'd be like, can't you just do it? It's not that hard. You've just got to let the rope go through that little fitting there. You've just got to pull it through. It's not that hard. And so I'd have this full rant at the boat. And then afterwards, when I'd calm down and I'd finished changing my sails and I'd got everything under control, I'd have some deep breaths and then I'd have to pat the boat and say, thank you. I'm really sorry for shouting at you.
So let's talk a little bit about the actual circumnavigation of the Antarctic. And I understand from the maps I've seen that you sailed between 45 and 60 degrees latitude. Why is that latitude the sweet spot where you have to be?
In 2008, a Russian sailor, Fedor Konyakov, set the record, and he sailed solo, non-stop and unassisted around Antarctica. And he did it through a racetrack or a platform called the Antarctica Ocean Race. And because he partnered with them, they set these kind of rules around it. And they had intentionally trying to turn it into a race where you would have country against country, fully crewed boats and solo divisions. And they would do this yacht race around the world, keeping between the latitudes of 45 and 60 south. So when he did the record, he left from Albany in Western Australia, sailed directly south into a gate entry, like a waypoint gate entry marker at 45. And then once he was on the racetrack, so to speak, he wasn't allowed to go north of 45 degrees south or south of 60 degrees south. So he had to sail within that band for the whole circumnavigation until he returned back to Albany in Australia, and there was an exit marker for the gate exit, and then you sail back up to Albany in Western Australia. So when I made contact with the World Sailing Speed Record Council with the intention of doing this record and the intention of trying to break Fedor Konyakov's record, I was instructed that I would have to conform to the same race rules, even though I wasn't doing the same event, and that I would have to start and finish from the same location that Fedor Konyakov did. So that meant that I was leaving from Albany and sticking between those markers of 45, 60 south. So I sailed from Eden all the way over to Western Australia to Albany, which was 2,000 miles, and it was really important to be able to do that trip on my own because I hadn't actually sailed the boat on my own. And so that was my adjustment time to work out whether the systems are working as they should, that I was comfortable with the layup on the boat. And she's a big boat to sail on your own. She's 50 feet long. And one of the biggest comments I would always get from people at boat shows and the likes was, everyone would always tell me that the boat was too big for someone to sail solo, and I would always say that there's a will, where there's a will, there's a way. You've just got to know how. So that was my kind of test run with the boat before the record.
You headed down south, you get to the waypoint at 45 south, and then you turned left, I suppose, and go anti-clockwise around Antarctica.
Yes.
And you got about 3/4 of the way through the journey when disaster struck.
G'day guys, this is Lisa Blair. You're listening to Real Risk, the adventure podcast with Richard Harris. So it was 72 days into the record and 3/4 of the way around. So we'd sailed around Cape Horn solo, which was through a force 12 gale, which was pretty exciting, past Iceberg Alley and through the Falkland Islands and everything. And then I was just exiting the South Atlantic Ocean and about to enter into the South Indian Ocean. And I was sort of just at the bottom edge of South Africa on the eastern side, but I was 1,000 nautical miles south from land. Through all my planning, my risk management, my risk assessment, I had always kind of counted on the fact that one of the great disasters was probably going to happen at some point, and I would need to have a way to combat that or manage that. And so in my preparation and my planning, I'd planned for knockdowns, rollovers, collisions at sea, collisions with ice, the boat flipping tail overhead, demasting, losing keel, losing rudder. And one of the greatest risks I had identified was me, and what would happen if I got injured or if I broke my leg or if I cracked my rib, because I'd be no longer in a position to sail the boat or to help myself. So because of all the kind of unknown factors and the fact that it was 14,000 nautical miles for the passage and it was going to take 3 months and I was going to be in, force 12 like storm conditions for majority of the time, I knew that the fatigue and the wear and the tear on the boat was going to be quite extensive. So I'd always taken the approach of sail a really fast boat slowly. And it means that I can shorten my sail area early. I don't have to push hard to get a half decent speed. I don't need to have great speeds to beat this record. I just had to go above 6.5 knots for the record to actually beat Fedor Konyakov's time. So I was taking this approach, and I don't think I changed my attitude necessarily, but the boat had already had, 2 months of hard yakka, and I was lying in bed one evening. It was 6 p.m. at night. I'd just gotten up on deck and checked everything before dark to just see what was going on and just check everything was fine. I was in a storm, but it wasn't a massive storm at that point, but it was due to get a bit worse through the night and then start easing from sort of midnight onwards. I went back to bed, and I was in bed maybe 10, 15 minutes, and I just heard bang. And it was the loudest noise. It was like a gunshot ringing off, where it was like this metallic kind of after ringing. And I realized something had broken that was probably pretty important. And I was out of my bunk and up onto my engine box instantly. And above my engine box, I have a little perspex dome, so I can see out of the boat without actually having to go outside and in all the weather. And the air temperature outside is generally 2 to 6 degrees, so it's freezing cold. I thought that my running backstay had broken, which is a rope piece of rigging wire that runs from the very back of the boat to the very top of the mast. So when I jumped on the engine box, I looked to the back of the boat and I could see the running backstay was fine, and it was there, and it was dark already at this point, but I could just see it with my head torch. And then I looked to the front of the boat, and I could just see my mast bending and wobbling and completely unsupported. And we were still sailing and we were still bashing into these waves. And every time we kind of crashed off a wave, the mast would flex to the side dramatically. And I knew that I'd broken a piece of rigging wire. So my next step was to tack the boat, which is change direction and put the pressure from the wind and everything on the side that hasn't got the broken piece of rigging wire. But I have a rule of 5 that I implement on my boat, where I take 5 seconds to make a full assessment before running willy-nilly out into a dangerous situation, because that 5 seconds isn't going to change what damage is occurring or has already occurred to the boat, but it might be the difference between me thinking with clarity or me thinking off adrenaline, or taking correct steps like grabbing my life jacket or tethering myself to the boat. So I took my 5 and I reached for my life jacket, and I was clipping it on as I was trying to think through all the steps that I would need to do. And just as I turned to climb outside the hatch, I heard the mast snap, and it was probably the worst sound I think you could ever hear. And it's just like, I think if you imagine like a car getting crushed in a car yard, that screeching metal and that grinding, groaning noise, and everything's tensioned with the mast. And so when the mast snaps, it releases all that tension through the boat. So the whole boat shakes and shudders and creaks and groans. And, I was still inside the boat, so the noise was just amplified. And yeah, it was terrifying. So I lost my rigging at deck level, which is quite unusual to lose it at the deck level. And I now had a 22-meter long spear tangled up with pieces of rigging and rope that was at risk of potentially putting a hole in my boat and sinking me. And my storm was due to get worse. So yeah, it wasn't a fun position to be in.
Was that something that you were mentally prepared for or had thought about and planned for?
Yeah, I'd actually had quite a lot of discussion with different riggers and shipwrights about the best way to manage a demasting. There's very little information that's good on the internet about it. There's information on how to build a jury rig later on, but there's not a lot of instant information, especially from a solo point of view, on how to react. How do you manage something like that when you're on your own? the tonnage and the force involved with all of this stuff was just astronomical. And the boat was now anchored in the middle of a storm with 8 to 10 meter waves like rolling over the top of us. So they would break against the side of the boat and drown the boat, and the whole boat would be going underwater. So trying to do anything in that environment in the dark on your own is just, yeah, it's difficult. And to be honest, I think the only reason I was able to survive that night was because I had the prior planning in place, and I didn't just run off fear and adrenaline. I had logic to still apply to the situation, and I only retained my logic because I knew that this was a calculated situation that I could dig myself out of. And I don't think I would have necessarily had that opinion if I hadn't considered what the boat would do in a situation like a demasting, and how would I feel, and how could I keep myself safe, and what tools and equipment would I need on board the boat to enable me to survive a situation like that. That forward thinking, that pre-planning definitely helped kind of ground me, but at the same state, it was probably about 15 minutes of just sheer running off adrenaline and panic before I actually calmed down enough to logically start assessing the situation correctly, and sort of remove myself from that fear a little bit to some extent, and just process the steps I would need to do to actually cut the mast free.
I think when you're in a genuinely life-threatening situation like you faced that night, you've kind of got two options, haven't you? You can either panic and lock up with fear, in which case your fate is almost certainly sealed, or you can say, well, I can only do my best and begin a methodical approach to solving the problem, because in so many of these kind of situations, panic is death. It is completely unproductive. And I've found in the couple of times when I've been in significantly difficult situations, to rise above the panic and start to act in a methodical manner is almost therapeutic. It's one of the ways that you actually keep the panic at bay, is to start doing things in a sequential fashion. So
yes.
Did that help you, that sort of activity, to just keep working through the issues?
Yeah, well, I was initially felt like I was under a huge time pressure because the mast had snapped and it was 90 degrees to the boat. And so what was happening was, as these sort of 8 meter waves were rolling through, they were pressing the mast up onto the deck of the boat, and then the back of the wave would like try and rip it off. And so it was sort of seesawing aggressively on the deck, and it was snapping wires and grinding. It was literally cutting me in half. So I felt like I had a very limited amount of time to try and separate the mast from the boat before it put a hole in the boat. And I knew without a shadow of a doubt that if the boat sank, I wasn't going to make it. And there's no way you can work around that. I was 1,000 nautical miles from land. I was 3 days from the nearest ship, and to survive in the middle of the Southern Ocean in a storm in below freezing temperatures for days in a life raft was not a possibility that anyone would really survive that. So my whole focus was save the boat, because if I couldn't save the boat, then I couldn't save my life. I didn't care about the damage. I didn't care about the fact that I was stranded. I cared about the fact that the boat was going to be still floating at the end of it. And I think that was a pivotal point to get that kind of narrow line of focus.
I read the story of how you had your tools pre-prepared and you took them out onto the deck, but I was struck by the fact you didn't.
Pencil case.
Yes, that's right, the girly toolkit. I was struck by the fact that you didn't have an item that would just cut through those halyards and stays and things that would just be able to cut that stainless steel wire. Was that an oversight, or is there just not the right tool for that job?
It's a little bit of both, I think, because with risk, I guess you assess the likelihood of that to occur. And then if it does occur, what's the fastest removal method? And through, I think, almost every yacht I've ever been on, and in fact, the global yachting standard is to take a set of bolt cutters with you. The thing that people forget is trying to balance, like bolt cutters generally use your body weight. So you wedge them in on the floor and then you jump on them. And you can't do that on a moving surface with the boat pitching and rolling. And so I had the bolt cutters that should have cut the wire, but they were impossible to use. And I'm too small a person to have optimized them properly. And so I had my bolt cutters, I tried them, they didn't work. And then I also had a backup plan of, in a hot pants pink pencil case, which I loved. I had a multi-grips, a pair of needle nose pliers, a large flathead screwdriver, and a hammer. And the concept was to disconnect the mast from the boat rather than trying to cut the mast from the boat. And that's, when every time we change the rigging out or we do a service on the boat, we do this step. So it's not an overly complicated procedure. But again, it was the limitations of the boat moving and rolling, the wire not being under tension, so it would spin and rotate, so I couldn't get a good grip on things, that really slowed down that process. But that was ultimately the technique that I used to save the boat.
So in that moment, really looking down the barrel for a few hours there, what was worse for you, the fear of death or the fear of failing in what you'd set out to do?
I wasn't thinking about the project because the project was non-existent to survival. With any project that I develop or set out to, or challenge that I set out to achieve, the main and only focus of the trip is to come home safely and stay alive. The rest, whether I need to void the record to do that or not, becomes immaterial to the value of a human life. So for me, it was definitely... Well, I didn't have any time to process it at the time because I was busy fighting it. And I knew if I stopped to process it, I probably wouldn't be able to fight it. But it was definitely the preservation of life that was my driving force, and the fact that, I went from happily being 4 weeks from finishing a world record after 70 days at sea. And I was beating Fedor Konyakov and I was doing really well and we were building media attention and it was all going perfectly swimmingly, to 10 minutes later being in a life or death situation where my mindset went from, hang on, I might not survive tonight. And then 2 hours into the emergency, I had to do something else. And it went from, hang on, I might not survive the night to I might not be alive in the next 5 minutes. And I think for me, there was some existing trauma from that or leftover trauma from all of that. And I think it's taken a couple of years to process. And I still don't know whether I've processed it all, but it's definitely a pretty heart-wrenching experience to go through.
Yeah, and the subsequent, difficulty working through that just because it was such a terrifying moment. I gather it's when you're on the bow prod and trying to get rid of the remaining hardware.
Yeah, I mean, there was a section, as you just mentioned, where the only way to release the forward rigging wire was to climb onto the bow of the boat and release it from the bowspritter. Now, that meant that I was completely exposed to these breaking waves and I was already getting my feet washed out from underneath me and dragged halfway down the deck of the boat by every wave that was coming through. So in my mind, I didn't think that I would be strong enough to hold on when I was completely exposed at the front of the boat. But if I didn't go out to the front of the boat, I knew the boat was going to sink. So it was kind of like this do or die, and neither option was going to be good. But I had to process the fact that I've got to say goodbye to my family. I might not be around in the next hour, or, how's this going to look? And I knew if I got washed off the bowsprit that I would drown against the side of the boat.
And in those moments, do you think about family and do you feel guilt about what you might be leaving them with, that burden of worry and sadness?
I think I was too busy in that scenario. I had made the decision that I would need to tell people that I was going to go and do that. So I phoned my shore manager up and we had a procedure in place where I wouldn't make contact with my family directly in any emergency because they can't react to the emergency correctly because they're too emotionally involved. So I had a shore manager who volunteered, Jeff. So I phoned him up and I said, this is what I have to do. I have a PLB on my life jacket, which is a personal location beacon, and I have to climb out on this bowsprit to save the boat. But if I trip my PLB, that means I've gone in the water. And to me, that was kind of my way of telling people that don't bother coming down, because if I was in the water, then I would succumb to hypothermia before help would arrive, and I would be so submerged in freezing water and my strength was already depleted. I was losing dexterity in my hands by that point that I knew I almost certainly wouldn't be able to climb out of the water and onto the boat again. I don't think it was until after that I really started to think about family and stuff. But I had conversations with my family before I left about the possibility that I might not come back from this project. And I'd said to them, that will be devastating, but it's okay because it means that I'm out doing what I love and living my life, and I could die in a car accident next week, or I could do any of those other horrible ways to go. Instead, I'm out here living my dream, and if I'm not strong enough, then I'm not strong enough, but that's okay.
You jury-rigged a repair and you actually motor sailed with a bit of assistance from a passing ship for some fuel up to Cape Town. Because of that terrifying experience you'd had, was it hard to come back and sail south again to finish the job?
It wasn't until the end of the next day that I'd made the repairs on the boat, cleared any debris from the water, that I made a formal decision to void my world record. Because I was analysing the fact of whether I could jury-rig the boat and sail it to Australia. But because I had a hole that was like 30 centimetres in size at the side of the boat where the mast had been cutting me through, and because of that being at such a structural point of the boat, I worried about the compromised strength of the boat, especially in massive 10-metre waves, and if the boat got between two peaks, whether it could actually buckle in the middle and snap in half if I was to attempt to finish the record under jury rig. And I remember making the decision to turn the engine on and taking the safer choice and telling myself that it's okay because I can do this and then I can come back and try again later. But I remember being very lifeless, listless, despondent. All the joy had gone out of it. And it was because I felt like a failure, like I felt like I had failed. And I'd always sort of mentally tried to tell myself that it didn't matter if I set the record. It didn't matter if I finished the trip. What mattered was that I got to the start line, because that was harder than anything up until the demasting. And trying to have that self-belief against all these people telling me that it's impossible and that you can't do it and that you shouldn't do it, and you're just a girl, why do you think you're capable of doing that, you're nuts. That was always harder than the record itself, aside from the demasting. So it wasn't until on that motor north, when I built the jury rig and everything, that I started thinking about the possibility of fixing the boat in South Africa and restarting the record, that I actually felt like I had energy again and that I had enthusiasm again. And I guess that was what continued to keep me focused, was the goal of actually restarting the record and completing it with one stop. And so it wasn't until I had established that goal that I really had energy again to kind of move forward from anything. So
you ended up with a different record, I guess, but a record that nonetheless it became a slightly assisted single stop circumnavigation of Antarctica.
Yeah, well, I think to me, I still feel like I was unassisted in a lot of retrospects, because I did get fuel off a passing container ship and I did motor to South Africa. By doing that, I was able to head off again and just start that process again and finish the trip. Now, I technically am considered assisted with one stop, but that passage from Cape Town back to where I demasted, I actually resailed that myself. I didn't motor any of that distance. I was determined to make sure that I sailed every section of that ocean as much as I could. So the only section that I actually had any assistance in was the motor to South Africa. And I was determined to go back to where I demasted, cross my position, and then restart on the record and continue the voyage. And I can tell you that 10 days sailing down were probably the worst of the whole trip. The demasting was bad, but it was unexpected and something you just had to react to. The passage down through the Southern Ocean in winter was just a mental game, complete mental game. I'd had some negativity come out just before I left when word started getting around that I was restarting my record. And everyone was like, well, it's winter. You can't sail across the South Indian Ocean in winter. You're going to kill yourself. It's a suicide mission. What are you doing? Blah, blah, blah. And I remember asking all these people, like, where's the historical weather data that shows you this is impossible? Because the information I've got and that my meteorologist has put together shows that it will be slightly larger swells, more cold, and the storms more frequent. But none of the conditions are going to be worse than what I've already sailed through. And the boats handled those things quite okay. So I was quite confident with the boat. About 5 days in, I'd been just getting my ass whooped by storm after storm. And the storms are 500 to 1,000 miles long. And in the middle of the storms, you got winds of 80 knots. And the waves on the forecast where I was sailing were coming through at 15 meters. So that's like a 4-story building coming at you. And then when you add the wind on top, the top sort of 3 or 4 meters of the wave kicks over and breaks. So you get this wall of white water that slams into the boat, and nothing's strong enough to combat that. Like the force of 1 square meter of white water is 1 ton of pressure being applied. So that was the moment I mentally wasn't in the right place, because I'd had all this negativity shoved at me and all these people telling me that I couldn't do it. And I'd just recently overcome a major failure. I also was seasick, and then I got a really bad head cold, probably one of the worst I'd had in a couple of years. And I was like body aches, fever, like all congested, just feeling like utter crap. I had a few chafe issues and small problems with the boat, but there were quite a few of them. And I was worried that I'd overlooked things with the boat, and that I'd rushed my departure trying to beat winter. And all in all, I just wasn't in a really good space. And then I had checked my position on the charts, and after 5 days of battling through literal hell, I was 200 miles from land, and literally like a day and a half sail from land. And I realized that I'd gone like almost nowhere, and I was doing donuts in the Southern Ocean, putting myself through all of this, and I couldn't do it. And I quit. I went below and I called Mum and I said, I'm voiding the record. I quit. I can't do it. I'm not strong enough. Those people are right. But I was in the middle of a storm at the time, and I was hove to, so I couldn't do anything until the storm passed. So Mum said, just chill out, like wait for the night, and when the storm passes tomorrow, let's have another chat and see how you're feeling then. And in the meantime, she sent me this amazing email, which when you talk about mindset and attitude with projects, I'll share with you the advice that she gave me at the time, and it flipped me from being a negative thinker to a positive thinker. She asked me to put myself in the position of 72 days into my record, where I never demastered, and I was just 4 weeks from finishing my record in Australia, and I was 1 day ahead of the men's record. And that I was feeling like this, and that I was seasick, and that I had this head cold, and I had these issues with the boat, and I had weather like this. In that position where I never demastered, where I wasn't restarting a new part 2 of a voyage, would those issues around the boat have been enough to make me quit? And was the storm really so bad that it would be enough to make me quit and alter my course for South Africa? And I remember thinking about it and comparing my emotional state at that moment with the emotional state I had a day before I demastered. And I realized that I would never have quit in that moment. I would have pushed through. I would have figured out another way through. I would have made the repairs to the boat, and I would have carried on. And so with a night of thinking on that, I decided to continue, and I sailed to where I demastered and crossed my track and then finished the voyage.
Wow, good old mum, eh?
Yeah, got to have mum.
Yeah. Your tenacity and courage is actually truly inspiring, Lisa, to hear that story, to endure what you went through and to keep going and to push on with a little bit of help from mum is an amazing story. And I actually love what you said about just getting to the start is a huge achievement, particularly knowing what you have to go through to get a boat on the water and to get yourself down to Albany and starting this adventure. And for most people, that is beyond comprehension, let alone actually finally doing the big lap of the biggest, widest continent in the world. So I just want to offer my congratulations. And I know that you've gone on to do more amazing things. You've circumnavigated Australia. You're teaching your offshore sailing masterclasses. You've got a book coming out, if it's not already.
Yeah, it's due out in October, actually, so people can pre-order on the website.
And that's called Demastered?
We've just actually released a new name for it. So it's now called Facing Fear because it suits the story so much better. So yeah, that's online. You can pre-order it on my website and it should be released in October.
And you're also inspiring women to do more sailing and get out and be more adventurous, which I think is great as well.
Yeah, I try. And I also try and promote the message of climate action now and hopefully inspire people to create a positive environmental change in their life and a positive action that they can do. So it's a big part of why I sail.
Well, you're a bloody legend, and thank you so much for talking to me today, Lisa.
You're so welcome. Thanks for having me on the show.
That's it for this episode of Real Risk. If you're a risk taker or know someone who'd be good for the show, please send me an email on admin@speleopix.com.au. I'd love to hear from you. Let me know what you think of the podcast. Subscribe, give me a rating, but most importantly, join me for the next one. We'll see you again on Real Risk.